Hello. Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. The Indiana Journal of Law and Social Equality and our editor-in-chief, Mr. Tristan Fretwell, he's back here very graciously handing out biographies, and myself would like to welcome you to our fall panel on the law and history of Puerto Rico. The Journal would like to thank the Indiana University Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the De Pueblo a Pueblo fundraising organization for their collaboration in putting on this event, as well as our faculty advisor, Professor Luis Fuentes Rower. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's discussion, Ms. Samantha Von Endy. Ms. Von Endy is a JD PhD candidate at Mauer and an editor emeritus of the Journal of Law and Social Equality. Her doctoral research focuses on the role of federalism and constitutional processes in achieving social, economic, and political stability within plural societies. Puerto Rico has existed in a unique liminal space of American law for over a century. In the debates over the territory's rightful legal status, the importance of Puerto Rican identity has remained constant. The poet Julio de Burgos said, "Me alegro por Puerto Rico, pues donde quiera que vaya, seré puertorriqueña." I rejoice for Puerto Rico, because wherever I go, I will be Puerto Rican.
Is this on? Yes. Hello? Is this on? I can't tell. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam. And thank you, Anasuya, for putting together this panel and for the introduction. So we're joined today by our two panelists. Professor Arlene Diaz is an associate professor with Indiana University's Department of History. She is now working on a book that applies digital history methods to uncover how science and technology informed the ways which knowledge was covertly and overtly gathered, represented, and diffused in written and visual form, and used to influence foreign policy during the Spanish-Cuban-American War. The effects of this war have direct bearing on the panel today and many other effects. As a principal investigator of Indiana University's History Learning Project, Professor Diaz has co-authored articles in the Journal of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. She regularly teaches courses on Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Caribbean history at IU. Welcome, Professor Diaz. Mr. Joel Bonilla-Blonde is a colleague of mine, a JD PhD student, in doing his work at the Center for Constitutional Democracy at IU Maurer School of Law. He worked with the CCD in several capacities. He's directed affiliate research on Puerto Rico's current constitutional and democratic structure. He received his BA in both political science and economics and has since completed an MBA since he's joined Maurer's Law School. His scholarship through the PhD examines economics and constitutionalism in colonial and post-colonial Caribbean contexts. So, welcome, Joel.
All right, so before we begin and before our distinguished guests share some of their knowledge with us, we have decided to show a clip from this documentary from 1965 that provides a very kind of triumphalist and interesting historical perspective on the economic development of Puerto Rico in the 20th century.
If you visit Puerto Rico today, you may still see slums reaching out from San Juan into the sea. Or they may have already vanished. Or there are changes taking place today that only a short time ago no one believed possible. We are tearing down the walls of this Caribbean poorhouse and lifting ourselves by our own bootstraps. Puerto Rico's first elected governor, Luis Muñoz Marin, a man of uncommon vision and honesty, perhaps of greatness, was our leader on the long road out of the depths of despair. which jobs could be created. This is how it worked. The government would build a factory, whole blocks of fresh, modern factories, and then, by every possible means, try to persuade established private companies to buy or rent the factories from us and operate them. But it was essential that these companies have already existing markets outside Puerto Rico, for they could expect to sell little here. We told American manufacturers about the palm trees and trade winds, offered them freedom from taxes for up to 17 years, offered them every incentive we could think of, including a large labor force ready and able to work. It took time, money, hard work, and good leadership. But as a result, nearly 1,000 American companies have established plants in Puerto Rico since 1950. To showcase, but there is still so much to do. Muñoz Marin, during his long years as governor, said this many times in describing the ultimate purpose of Puerto Rico.
We certainly are proud of what we have done, but we are not satisfied. There is much yet to do. Economically, socially, educationally, politically. This is one of our chief tenets, that the economy is the servant of the spirit, and not the spirit the servant of the economy. That's what I call Operation Serenity. We feel that as the economy reaches certain levels, a greater amount of the wealth, not only of the income of the government, but of the income of the economy as a whole, of the people as a whole, should be diverted to higher uses, to better education, to the arts, to scientific institutions, to museums, to the spiritual goods that mankind must have.
We owe much to
Okay. So we're going to open with some remarks from both of our panelists, just to frame the discussion a bit, not in terms of their remarks, but perhaps in terms of the way the audience interacts with the information. I think it'd be useful to leave this talk trying to have an understanding of, where are we in terms of, in context, positioning. Where is Puerto Rico right now in terms of its legal and economic status? How did we get here? And where are we going from here? So, Joel?
Thank you very much for everybody to come here. I'm excited to be able to share this space with you and for us to together work through some of these issues. I intend to run this in a very informal way, right? So if you have any questions, please just raise your hands. There is no stupid question, really, trust me. Been there, we've all been there, right? So please just let's have a conversation. I thought that for us to start, it would be useful if we have some sort of background information about what the history of Puerto Rico and the United States is and where it's been, where it's heading. And so that's where I'm going to start. And to start, I'm going to talk about an episode that happened at the beginning of American forces coming to the island, taking control over Puerto Rico, and how this, and I hope this history or this little story can help you understand sort of the relationship that the U.S. and Puerto Rico have shared over more than 100 years now. So American forces invaded Puerto Rico in July 25th, 1898, in the middle of the Spanish-American War, right? Shortly after invasion, the U.S. refused to pay outstanding debts that had been incurred by the Spanish in the island, right? And they developed, the U.S. jurisprudence was developed in order to do this, and the name was the odious debt jurisprudence, right? And odious debt, what it says is that the U.S. will refuse to pay any debt incurred by Spain unless it is legal and unless it relates directly to the territories in some fashion, right? Or the U.S. deems that it is with regards to the territories. Now, at the same time that American forces invaded the island, the American government devalued the Puerto Rican peso 40% overnight, right? So what this should tell you is that whatever savings or capital people had, overnight it was devalued 40%. So if you had a mortgage, guess what? You owe 40% more because now it's denominated in US dollars. So this sent thousands of freehold land holdings into default. Now, the American government at the same time also organized the American Colonial Bank and made it work in Puerto Rico. And this bank, what it did is it went and helped the farmers remortgage their properties at a really high rate of interest, right? At this point, usury laws are not in effect. So it really was predatory lending. By the end of the decade, in around 1930s, all land holdings in Puerto Rico can be reduced to 48 sugar mill syndicates, 80% of which were in U.S. hands. When my mother was born in 1948, basically 4 U.S. companies owned all the land on the island. And my mother was actually born in a company town. Now, this sort of this story is to illustrate the sort of relationship that the U.S. and Puerto Rico have shared, right? At some moments, the U.S. has paid incredible attention to Puerto Rico, but at others, and attention to the point of, some might argue, exploitation. In others, there's a sort of forgetfulness, of imperial forgetfulness, right? That just kind of neglects Puerto Rican needs. In order to frame this properly, I'm going to discuss the main cases that have shaped Puerto Rican-U.S. relations. I will also talk about main acts of Congress that have also shaped that, and then I will hand it over to Professor Diaz to talk more about it. The first case that we need to talk about, it's Downs versus Bidwell. It's part of what's known as the Insular Cases, which is a series of cases that kind of define the relationship that the U.S. shares with its territories. We also need to remember that during this time, end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, we're in the middle of manifest destiny, right? There's no limit to where the U.S. can go and what it can acquire. And at the same time, European powers were dividing the world amongst themselves in Africa and Asia. And so the U.S. has this very contentious relationship with itself about, what do I want to do? Do I want to have territories? Do I not want to have territories? I fought a war of independence. Am I an empire? Am I not? And so we can see some of this dichotomies in these cases. In Downs versus Bidwell, Justice Henry Billings Brown, this case was about both Hawaii and Puerto Rico. He describes that these sort of new war booty, so to speak, right, is belonging to but not part of the United States, right? Because the United States is not ready yet to sort of have dominions, but at the same time it's not ready yet to just incorporate these people that are completely different into itself. Right, so he says they're belonging to but not part of the United States. They're alien races, I'm quoting, and they're incapable of understanding Anglo-Saxon principles. And because of that, Puerto Rico and Hawaii are foreign to the United States in a domestic sense. Now, those of you who have taken common law, which is most of you should see some kind of wordplay here, right? That we've come to expect from the Supreme Court and things like this, right? This yes but no. So it's foreign, but it's domestic. It's alien races, but it's belonging, but it's not part of, right? This is still good law. It was actually used by the Obama administration in a case brought by American Samoa with regards to citizenship. And it's also the basis for many loopholes with regards to what sort of laws apply to Puerto Rico and which ones do not, by the fact that it's belonging to but not part of the United States. So right after this was 1901. The question was, wait, so does the flag follow the Constitution? Now, just 3 years later, we have Gonzalez versus Williams in 1904. And the holding was like Puerto Ricans are non-citizen nationals, right? So they are not citizens, but they're still nationals of the U.S. And this is still good law and still applies to American Samoa. American Samoans, in their U.S. passport, it says, the bearer of this passport is a United States national and not a United States citizen. Still good law, still applied. So we begin to see a wedge in the ways that territories are treated versus parts of the United States. In 1922, we forward to Balzac versus Puerto Rico, which is a landmark case because it holds that the Constitution does not apply in full to the territories. Only fundamental, I quote, fundamental rights are automatically in effect, which is the reason why we, for example, have Guantanamo, and the Constitution does not fully apply there, right? So these are cases that are central to Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States, and you should start to see a kind of pattern in the way that the United States reacts or views these territories and the people who have it within them. Now, I want you to take the cases together with the acts of Congress so you can understand. The Forker Act of 1900s, this was just 1 year after the U.S. came into Puerto Rico. It establishes Puerto Rican citizenship and a civilian government, but the civilian government is appointed by the president, and this continued until 1952, after the Constitution of Puerto Rico was passed, and we had the first democratically elected government. After the Forkers Act, we have the Merchant Marine Act of 1917, which is also known as the Jones Act, requires use of the U.S. Merchant Marines for all territories. So anything that is taken into or taken out of a territory is to be done through U.S. flagships that are made in the U.S., owned by U.S. persons, and manned by U.S. crew. Now, for those of you who know anything about shipping, this is one of the most protectionist, closed statutes in the world with regards to shipping, and this is still good law. This is still active, and it's one of the reasons why anything that comes into Puerto Rico is over 30% more expensive than the mainland U.S. For example, Puerto Rico could use the Spanish Merchant Marine, and it's 1/4 of the price of U.S. Merchant Marine, and it's halfway across the world. So this is a legal monopoly that's basically protectionistic and just helps American companies. And we'll see a lot of that in Puerto Rico's history. We have the Jones-Trafford Act of 1917, which extends U.S. citizenship to people living in Puerto Rico and thus abrogates Puerto Rican citizenship. And it does so, it applies retroactively to before the U.S. invaded. And you might ask yourself, why? Well, because right after this statute was passed, males were conscripted to fight the First World War. And that's when Puerto Ricans become U.S. citizens, and it's become a pattern, right? So when you look at population per capita, Puerto Ricans fight more U.S. wars than any other minority in the United States. It also, the Jones-Trafford Act also creates a position of a resident commissioner, which is a sort of representative for the territories that has no vote in Congress, and it's only one regardless of population. It creates a Senate of Puerto Rico sort of Bill of Rights and makes Puerto Rican bonds triple exempt, which is an important thing. Triple exempt means that you pay no taxes, municipal, local, or state, right? I'm sorry, municipal, which are local, federal, or state taxes. You pay no taxes whatsoever on bonds that you acquire from Puerto Rico as an investor. And after that, we have the Puerto Rico Federal Relations Act of 1950 that authorizes Puerto Rico to enact a constitution subject to review by Congress. And it functions as the organic document of the government of Puerto Rico until this day, what it means is that the government of Puerto Rico is actually a creature of Congress, which can mean that Congress may decide to just sniff it out tomorrow if it so chooses, right? There's nothing withholding Congress from doing anything. And it goes back to, of course, the Versus Bidwell, right? And the property of, but not being part of the United States. And this is kind of the relationship that Congress has with Puerto Rico and the other branches. For example, during the George H.W. Bush administration, the Executive Commission report about Puerto Rico, concluding, as did Dowers versus Bidwell, that Puerto Rico was property of but not part of the United States, and that Puerto Rico could consequentially then be sold, given, or ceded to any country for any purpose whatsoever at any moment. And moreover, that if Puerto Ricans ever chose to separate themselves from the United States, although, of course, how can you just sell something and then say that someone can actually separate themselves from the U.S.? If they so did, then they would automatically lose U.S. citizenship, which, of course, runs at odds with the 14th Amendment, or so we would think. But then again, Dowers versus Bidwell does everything cover. Does the flag follow the Constitution? I think that's, for now, that's all I need to say.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming today. This is a wonderful audience. And thank you to the Indiana Journal of Law for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm expanding my frontiers the first time here at the law school in this room. So I thought that the way I would like to approach my 10 minutes, is to talk about some of the major hurricanes that have happened in Puerto Rico since 1899. Those that have been category 4 or 5. Because they have actually always brought something, have opened up the doors for making very clear the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. So starting with 1899, in August of 1899, Puerto Rico had the Hurricane San Ciriaco. And that was a very strong one, and it did a number of things that were that really helped the United States to get hold of Puerto Rico. And that was that first, it destroyed the coffee industry. Coffee bushes take 5 years to grow. It actually devastated a major portion of the economy, especially for the late 19th century. By doing so, the displacement of many rural people helped the United States when they actually devalued the conversion of the Spanish peso to the dollar. It was in a proportion of 60 cents per dollar. So these big sugar corporations could actually buy a lot of land for very little in Puerto Rico. And that led to the displacement of many, many people. And even with the Foraker Act that established that corporations could not own more than 500 acres of land, that was easily violated. A number of U.S. companies actually were owning at least 1/3 of all of the land in Puerto Rico. So that displacement started there. And also at the same time, the idea that Puerto Rico was overpopulated and that they needed to do something, that there were way too many Puerto Ricans. So the problem was not that there was a imbalance in terms of the amount of land that these people were having that had actually displaced people. The problem, they argue, was that there was too many people and that therefore they started to promote the immigration of Puerto Ricans. So since 1899, there was a big migration of Puerto Ricans to Hawaii to work on the sugar fields and also to the southern part of the United States. So that was San Ciriaco, 1899. In 1828, and then we had Hurricane San Felipe, a Category 5, and then San Ciprián in 1932, a Category 4. These two I'm going to put together because this was at the time of the recession, the Depression in the 30s, also World War I. But also this was a time in which Puerto Ricans started to question the idea that when the United States came into the island, they say that they would bring liberty, freedoms, and all of this good stuff to the Puerto Ricans. And the Puerto Ricans, and especially the upper class, started to say, wait a second, I used to own land, I don't anymore. So people started, there was a big pro-independence movement at the time, and people started to question U.S. rule. And they started to criticize a lot U.S. colonial policy. So it was at that time when these hurricanes were like a wake-up call to the failures of colonialism. However, at those moments in time, Puerto Rico was important for its geographical and strategical position within the Caribbean. Remember, the Panama Canal, the idea that European powers could actually have attacks on the Caribbean. It was at this time also later on when Roosevelt wrote that major naval station was established. In particular, it was established because it was going to supposedly to serve as a place where the British Navy could actually come to Puerto Rico and be protected there from any attacks from the Germans or other European nations. So at that time, the United States paid attention to Puerto Rico because it was important. It was strategically convenient for them to do so. So they started a number of programs to actually distribute land and industrialization, like the one that you just saw here, Operation Bootstrap. we can talk more about that if you want later on. But what I would also like to talk about is Hurricane Maria in September of this year. And even though right now officially the government says that there has only been like 51 people who have lost their life to Maria. Actually, it's more in the 900s if we consider all the people who actually passed away because they did not get their oxygen, they did not get their insulin, all the things that were related to all the devastation of the hurricane. So what Maria has done for Puerto Rico is that it exposed the poverty of Puerto Rico. It exposed how weak our infrastructure was. All the problems with the health services that has been going on for a good while. It also showed the crisis in political leadership in the local, at the local level, but also at the federal level. And it also showcased how much of Puerto Rico remains foreign to the U.S. in a domestic sense. When Puerto Rico becomes important, when it does not. So different from the other two 1928 and 1932 hurricanes, this Maria is different in the sense that Puerto Rico doesn't have that strategic position anymore. Okay? The collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba is no longer a threat, quote unquote. So the United States did not see much urgency in doing much for Puerto Rico. But also we need to consider Puerto Ricans do not vote for president. We have a resident commissioner that has voice but no vote. The interesting thing is that actually Puerto Ricans vote for primaries. And but not for president. However, if we move to the United States, then we vote for president. And that's something to keep in mind. So that actually explains also the lack of urgency for many politicians who go to Puerto Rico. They're not going to get many more votes. However, and I would make here a footnote. I recommend that we follow the steps of the Puerto Rican diaspora, especially in Florida. We'll see what's going to happen because Puerto Rico usually was not a stronghold for Trump. They actually, in the primaries, Marco Rubio won. And I would say that Puerto Ricans overwhelmingly, Trump is no friend in Puerto Rico, much less after throwing all the paper towels to us. So one of the things that made it very interesting about Maria for us is that it exposed, especially for stateholders, the idea that, you want to become a state and look at how they're treating us. There has been no urgency whatsoever to deal with the devastation of the island as we speak. But also, something that has become very important in this time of disaster has been the diaspora. It became an unexpected economic and political force. It has become a powerful group here in the United States, writing to the senators, pushing for policies and the like. And I think that Maria is doing that really that important job for the huge diaspora. Right now, there are more Puerto Ricans in the United States mainland than in the island. And that's another interesting thing to consider. So the other point that for me has become very clear with Hurricane Maria is that even when the fact that the government is encouraging people to leave. And that is very suspicious, for me as a Puerto Rican. And also reading that one of the most important banks in Puerto Rico, Banco Popular de Puerto Rico, had actually made big earnings in the past 2 years. To the amount of $96 million. From 2016 to 2017, they increased their earnings by 8%. And that's quite a bit, especially if we consider that 46% of the people in Puerto Rico currently live under the level of poverty, and that 500 rich people, because they're there because of the tax exemptions, are owning more land than 2 million Puerto Ricans. So when you see these inequalities, and then you see that the major local bank is getting all of this earning, what is the relationship here? And it is here where I would like just to mention a couple of things, because it is, as a Puerto Rican, it has really opened my eyes as to what this hurricane is actually allowing us to see that we did not see before. So one of the points that has been discussed now by some scholars is the fact that the local banks have become more and more connected to the local government, okay, and that they have been using the government for their own benefit, and that is exactly what is happening in Puerto Rico right now. So. For example, the banks have been speculating with bonds. So they promote the idea for the government to buy the bonds. Then they use the bonds for things that were not producing earnings for the Puerto Rican government. And that's really suspicious, right? And then when they did not create earnings, then they sold those bonds for hedge funds, right? They don't lose. They don't lose money at all. So in the meantime, the Puerto Rican government is actually losing money because they were investing that in infrastructure that was never used. For example, there is like a urban train that doesn't really produce much for the government. A lot of people are not using that. A convention center that has not been used very much. So, and they have, the banks also have been playing with retirement funds. So what I'm trying to say with all this is that bankers have been also working with the government in enacting policies that benefit the banks. And as a result, they have actually promoted more neoliberal types of policies in Puerto Rico. So they are, for example, behind the idea that Puerto Rico, that the government needs to sell the electric company. So all of this thing with Whitefish and all of that, it's related to that. They are also very interested in selling the most important university, the University of Puerto Rico, that has a huge trajectory and is a major institution in Puerto Rico. We can talk more about that. They are also very interested in selling the school system. So the current Secretary of Education has been reluctant to open the schools, even though they're ready to be opened. So what they are trying to do is to use Maria as a way to keep selling Puerto Rico, okay? Selling Puerto Rico to these big millionaires who can actually have triple exemptions in the island. And that is a huge concern right now, especially when they are deliberately telling people, you must leave the island. Now, contradiction for me is that if you're in Puerto Rico and you're trying to buy a ticket to get out, it is insane. They're actually asking for $1,000 ticket to go to Miami, a less than 2 hour flight. And that's so they don't want to lose money at any cost. So what is striking for me is how much the government and the banks are actually profiting from this misery. And the idea, working from the United States and looking at my island, suffer this much is, what can we do? It's a very difficult situation. So I'm so glad that we're discussing this, because we have never gotten this much attention for so long in the media. So thank you so much for coming, and I really appreciate any questions you may have. I look forward to our conversation.
So Joel, I'd just like to give you a chance to respond to her if you had anything.
Sure. I finished my remarks discussing the acts of Congress and the insular cases, and I began with a story. right? But the story continues. And I think it's important for understanding Puerto Rico's current situation economically and politically, right? So right after, between the time that the U.S. came in and around 1950s, the U.S. government basically left Puerto Rico to be administered by the sugar companies. However, in 1945, the U.S. wins World War II, and things start hitting up with the Soviets, right? And all of a sudden, it's capitalism versus communism. And that's when Puerto Rico gets or acquires this incredible strategic importance as a stalwart against Soviet intrusion into the Americas, safeguarding the Panama Canal as well. And during that time, the U.S. says, wait, we need to do something about this island because it's incredibly underdeveloped. And so an incredible amount of funds starts pouring into the island, and the U.S. quickly decides that it needs to bring it up to speed, so to speak. So the U.S. Treats Puerto Rico as sort of a window glass for the rest of the Americas to what capitalism can do, juxtaposed to Cuba next door about what communism can do, right? And so the U.S. begins to make incredible amounts of just pours a lot of capital into the island to bring it up to speed, and that's Operation Bootstrap. So Operation Bootstrap is foreign direct investment to Puerto Rico, controlled by American capital, which then should be kind of like, well, foreign but not really foreign, right? So American companies are given a go, come into the island, you get tax breaks, you pay no tax, you can repatriate whatever you want, so you can build up the economy quickly. And we can get Puerto Rico as a sort of, hey, look at what Puerto Rico, what U.S. American power can bring you, and look at what Cuba and Fidel and the communists can bring you. And because of this, Puerto Rico experienced sort of a continued span of time in which it's given basically whatever it wants. And it's treated very generously by the U.S. government. Now, as you may expect, this ceases in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolves, right? After that, Puerto Rico enters into a sustained area of neglect. During the time when the U.S. was in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, Congress enacted what's called Section 936A of the IRS Code. And basically, Section 936 says you can come into Puerto Rico. It's foreign in the domestic sense, right? So you can come into Puerto Rico, make whatever you want, produce whatever you want, and then when you bring it to the U.S., you pay no tariffs. And when you repatriate your profits, no taxes, right? And so this brought an incredible amount of companies, mainly pharmaceutical and refineries as well, before the big crash at the end of the 70s, to Puerto Rico to do precisely that. Now, with the end of after 1999. 1991, the end of the Soviet Union, things started to change, and Congress quickly, I remember this when I was growing up at the end of the 90s, Congress signals to U.S. companies, hey, I'm going to take 936 out of the table because we need to bring that back to the U.S. And so by 2006, these incentives are completely phased out, and what would you know, 2006 is the beginning of a decade-long recession for Puerto Rico that's still ongoing. So this period of attention and forgetfulness is directly linked with Puerto Rico's political and economic fortunes. And that's really important to understand. So when at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 200s, when Congress was deciding to take out Section 936A and to sort of leave Puerto Rico to its own devices, politicians were not quite sure what to make of it in Puerto Rico. And although when you look at the history of debt for the island, the government had accumulated some debt during the intervening years, beginning with Operation Bootstrap in 1950 until around the end of the 1990s, but this debt was completely manageable and normal for nations to have. However, when these sort of incentives dry up, Puerto Ricans had been accustomed to have a certain sort of services provided by the government. Politicians say, well, I'm sure Congress will come back with something, right? This is kind of like a drought for U.S.-Puerto Rico relations. We're being kind of like left out to our own devices, but they'll come back, they'll pay attention to us again. Look at what's happened to us. That's been their political life, right? So these politicians were brought up into the sort of Operation Bootstrap. Now they start to accumulate a lot of debt to pay for essential services. right? To pay to keep things going. Because they expect that Congress is going to come and be like, yeah, I'm going to give you money so you can keep things going just as it had been before. But that didn't happen. And that's what we have right now. So the intervening years between about 2000 to now, the level of Puerto Rico debt, public debt acquired by the government of Puerto Rico skyrocketed to an unmanageable level. And that's tied, of course, to what we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So Professor Diaz alluded to some of the stakeholders who might be responsible for upholding or motivating the maintenance of the status quo. We talked about the government and businesses profiting off of this arrangement. Joel alluded to the propaganda value of developing Puerto Rico during the Cold War. I'm wondering, are there additional stakeholders? It can't just be inertia or gridlock. There seem to be so many things intersecting here. I mean, there's histories of colonialism and imperialism, the effects of racism in modern society. There's all these different strands, economic value. What is it that seems to be standing in the way, impeding progress? And then, as a secondary question, how does this affect politics on the island? Is the status question the main thing dividing political parties? How does this end up driving the politics there?
Well, in terms of impeding progress, we need to understand that all the limitations that Puerto Rico have, right? For instance, it may be like right now with the hurricane, Cuba wanted to send people to help. No, they cannot come. Venezuela wanted to send some help. No, because all of that is decided by Congress. So even if it would be cheaper for Puerto Rico to buy oil from Venezuela, we cannot do that because it is up to the U.S. Congress to decide that. Okay? So Puerto Rico, from the very beginning, has not been able to develop their own strategy of development or economic policies. So that policy has always been dictated by the United States. So even though our coffee industry then took on, but then, of course, with the hurricanes in 1928 and 1932 declined, what was our agriculture that actually provided quite a big amount of jobs, with Operation Bootstrap that went down. But it's very hard for Puerto Rico to put up policies that benefit our own economy because we are at the service of whatever the United States wants. So currently, for instance, at least 85% of the things that are brought in Puerto Rico, what we eat, are imported. So it costs more, right? Or you can bring a plantain brought from Dominican Republic, but it costs much less money than to produce one in Puerto Rico. So that type of relationship has not worked for the benefit of the Puerto Ricans. Okay? So as a result, what you find in Puerto Rico right after Operation Bootstrap, one of the problems with Operation Bootstrap, contrary to what they were saying in that video, is that it did not create, there were two phases of Operation Bootstrap, okay, in the 1950s. First one was a sweatshop phase. A lot of people got hired to produce clothing, Levi's, for example, and things of that sort. Then the second phase is the heavy capital one. So they would hire people that were more educated, but at the end of the day, it did not solve the problem of unemployment. So by the 1980s, what you find is that in Puerto Rico, is actually the United States is bringing in money. Food stamps. Started to give grants for students to go to the University of Puerto Rico. Why? A lot of needle population, and they knew that with a needle population, what had happened in Cuba, there could be another revolution in Puerto Rico. So you could also see that in the percentages by the 1980s, the government starts to hire a lot of Puerto Ricans. I think it was in the numbers like 20-some%. And that's a high percentage, and with all the effects that that's going to have on politics. So what do? You're going to vote for your party that gave you that job because otherwise you're not going to have a job, right? So that perpetuates this situation in Puerto Rico. In terms of impeding progress, I would say that the laws that were established by the United States since the Foraker Act, then reaffirmed by the Jones Act in 1917, have not worked for the benefit of developing a local economy in Puerto Rico for the benefit of Puerto Ricans. So what has happened is that when there is major crisis in Puerto Rico, buy a ticket and go to New York, which has happened in the 1950s. So the issue of population, which is also related to that, and I meant to mention this. So there has been also the strategy of kicking Puerto Ricans out, and when need be in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, part of the laws in Puerto Rico there were so many loopholes that allowed companies, for example, to develop, for example, contraceptives, Agent Orange. Those were tested in Puerto Rico. Saccharin was tested in Puerto Rico. And then, of course, sterilization of women. 1/3 of the female population was sterilized by 1970. Okay, but there's a whole story we can talk there. So impeding progress, I would say, again, the laws that were put into Puerto Rico, and then the fact that the political class in Puerto Rico, the same economy has helped more people, made more people to support whatever party their family would support as a strategy of survival. In the latest year, what we have seen is that the pro-statehood party, they know that the U.S. Congress is highly unlikely to approve of statehood for Puerto Rico, but they have lived out of that. So they keep doing referendums for Puerto Rico, and they know that that's not going to happen because what we forget is that from the Foraker Act, it is the U.S. Congress who has power over Puerto Rico. So if Puerto Ricans, I always tell this to my students at the college, if they decide they want to become citizens of Mars, it is up to the U.S. Congress to decide that, not of the Puerto Rican people.
Yeah. Yes. If we go back to the Puerto Rican Relations Act of 1950, we remember that the Puerto Rican government is a creature of Congress, right? And it's subject to the Constitution in the territorial clause, right? Part of the Constitution, which means that Congress is able to do whatever laws it wants without any restriction with regards to the territories. And what this means is that Puerto Rico has always been treated in an ad hoc fashion. It's never been either or, because the U.S. still hasn't resolved the issue of what it wants to do with its territories. And it still has Guam, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, right? North Marianas. And so for some things, Puerto Rico has been excluded completely, like the Investment Company Act of 1940, which is still going on, right? And so what that means is that a bunch of ethics provisions and laws that would mandate disclosure do not apply to Puerto Rico, which is why the Teachers Union Fund of Maryland is the Teachers Union Fund of Maryland, even though it's composed by 50.4% bonds from Puerto Rico, right? And if you're 50.4, then you're not really no longer a Maryland Teachers Fund, right? But it's not required because Puerto Rico is not included in the act, and so it can be named whatever you want. And similarly with Chapter 9 bankruptcy, right? So Puerto Rico was included in Chapter 9 bankruptcy as a municipality, not a state, until about 1983 when Strom-Thurmond put in an amendment that nobody knows where it came from, was passed with another bill, not discussed, not debated, and it excluded Puerto Rico from initiating bankruptcy 9 proceedings, which is how we get to PROMESA, right? Because Puerto Rico cannot pay, but is not entitled to initiate its own proceedings. What can it do? And that's when Congress comes in. When Congress comes in and does PROMESA, what it does, it treats Puerto Rico in an ad hoc fashion, creates an act specifically for a territory, and creates this federal oversight board that sits above the democratically elected government of Puerto Rico, and basically is in control of the island. So the governor cannot do anything that the federal control board does not allow the governor to do. And in effect, it should sound dictatorial to you, right? Because it is. And this is from the United States, right? We're not talking about any other country, which should be at odds with the way we perceive the United States to be. And we also need to remember that Puerto Ricans, because Puerto Rico is a non-incorporated territory, Puerto Ricans do not vote for president, are not entitled to representatives in Congress except for the non-voting resident commissioner, and they do not pay federal taxes, or that's the way it's supposed to be. But in reality, Puerto Ricans, because they are employed by the federal government in Puerto Rico or have connections to the federal government through contractors, they pay more federal taxes than places like West Virginia or Vermont, right? So Puerto Ricans are paying federal taxes, and also they pay payroll taxes just like everybody else. However, we get one-third of what Medicare we're supposed to get? Yes. So Puerto Ricans do not get 2/3 of what they're entitled to Medicaid by paying payroll taxes because they live in Puerto Rico, just because Congress so disposes through the territorial clause. And that's important to keep in mind. Please make questions.
Oh, no, something I wanted to mention is that very interestingly, the PROMESA Oversight Board includes 2 representatives of the banking industry that were part of that disaster, which is very interesting. So 2 of the people who were named by Obama to this board are intrinsically related to the banks that had to do with the debt in the first place.
Yes.
So this has been very interesting. I have plenty more questions, but I'm going to give you guys a chance.
Yes.
So any questions from the audience? Brooke.
Yesterday, as you mentioned the term statehooders, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I know that Joel and I talked at length actually about the divide between people who desire statehood versus independence, and then there was a large faction of people who desired the status quo and to remain as a territory. What impact has the recent hurricane reaction and also PROMESA had on the divide between Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And it is an excellent question because the governor, the current government, is a pro-statehood government. And many of them are actually, they lean more to the Republican Party as well. Since PROMESA, one of the things that have become clear is that their idea was to facilitate the statehood of the island. Okay, to use PROMESA as a way to create such a crisis, to make Congress then look at Puerto Rico and try to think about making Puerto Rico another state. I don't think it has worked because, on the contrary, what people have seen is that the local government and the federal government have been quite inefficient in the response to the devastation. But another point that I would like to make here is that not only the bankers are also linked to the oversight board, but one of them is also linked to the major media in Puerto Rico, the El Nuevo Día. So, for example, they have a good control of the media. When there was a major strike a general strike this past May, there was nothing in U.S. media, and they did not cover it in the local newspapers, even though I have never seen something like that in Puerto Rico. So there is control of the media. And the fact that many places in Puerto Rico do not get internet, secure internet. You may get it, it comes and goes. But especially for the rural areas, people do not know what's going on. Sometimes I have better sense what's going on. And when I talk to my family, where was that? They do not know because they cannot see the TV because if they don't have electricity, you see. So the circulation of information has been affected. So in terms of the stateholders, that would be a very good question to ask. Has this affected the way they perceive the government? I am not 100% sure. I think it has shaken some people, but other people remain business as usual because of the control of the media and the fact that they are not getting the information as they used to. I don't know if you have another...
Yeah, we have to remember that when we see colonial situations around the world, political action is organized around the same lines, right? So no matter where you go, if it has been a colony in the past or it's a colony currently, there's three factions that are politically active. People who want to annexate to the colonial power, people who want to be independent, or people who want to maintain the status quo. And this is has been the case, or was the case throughout Africa, and it's still the case even in places like Hong Kong, right? You have people who want to formally become politically part of China and end the one country, two systems, people who want to declare that Hong Kong is independent, and we saw some of them in the demonstration movement, and some of them have been jailed, and people who want to maintain the status quo. And this is the case in Puerto Rico. In a colony, everything is contested. History is contested, right? It's an ideological battle. And things that you may expect to be catalytics for things to change suddenly are not. For example, since 1952, when Puerto Rico approved its constitution, there's a faction of people, the status quo people, who believe that Puerto Rico had a sort of separate sovereignty, right? Because in Spanish, it's not Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, it's Freely Associated State of Puerto Rico. And this was done on purpose, but it's not free and it's not associated, right? Puerto Rico is not in control of anything. The fundamental relationship between the Puerto Rico and the U.S. has not changed, and it's enshrined in the acts of Congress that we've discussed, and in the case law, that's still good law, right? But for these faction of Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rico was a separate sovereignty that chose to associate itself with the United States, and so it remained a certain sort of sovereignty that it could exercise by itself. But the recent case of Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valle, the Supreme Court said, no, there is no separate sovereignty. This is a myth. You don't have sovereignty. You're a creature of Congress, and Congress has full powers under the territorial clause. You are a territory. But people in Puerto Rico still believe that they have a separate sovereignty. So the people from the status quo said, no, the executive branch is wrong with the three different reports that have been published that Puerto Rico is a territory. Congress is wrong that it can do whatever it wants, and the Supreme Court is wrong that Puerto Rico is a territory. We are different. So what you might expect, you take it from the horse's mouth that they're telling you you are not a separate sovereignty. You should expect that they change their views. They do not. Why? Because ideology is everything, and ideology is constantly battled for.
Other audience questions?
I actually have a question. So this is more to do with current events and Hurricane Maria. I know, Professor Diaz, you have been back since Hurricane Maria hit the island, and Joel, you haven't been back, but you've been in contact with your family members who are involved in relief efforts. And just if you could kind of give us, who are only sort of reading about this or hearing about it on the news, kind of your perspective or the perspective of people who are living it currently.
Perspective on what particular?
On just the effect of Hurricane Maria on the island, what it's like living through that right now.
Honestly, when we talk, I was there a week ago or so. I would say that when I talk to them, is this idea that everything's crazy, that everything is so hard, that they're tired. They're tired because they want to have they want their normalcy to go back again. We're talking that they lost electricity since Irma in early September, so it's been over 2 months now. So you wake up very early because once the sun is out, it gets very hot. So you may start. Actually, since then I've been waking up at 5 in the morning because of the same issue. So you take a shower and it's cold, it's okay. You handle it. So no blow drying, not your usual type of thing. Everybody's clothes is not ironed, So you get out. There's no traffic lights, so there's a lot of traffic, and it's crazy to go out. You have to be very careful. So everything takes more time. Everything takes more patience. The lines are very long. You may go to a supermarket and there may not be any water because you have to actually be at the supermarket at 7 a.m. to get water, to get gas or ice. A bag of ice that used to pay $1, now is $4. People have lost their jobs because if their companies are not open anymore, I think that the unemployment has gone like crazy. It's like 80% up since then. And we have lived that with some of our family members. So everything is most costly, right? It's hard to get out. It's hard to find a job. What do you do? And many people are actually, they wanting to get out of Puerto Rico just to be able to sleep under an air conditioner, to take a hot shower, to just catch your breath and, okay, now I can go back, right? I posted in Facebook like a week or so after the hurricane, just asking a group of professors. We have been working here on how we can help Puerto Rico, and especially the students. And I asked, okay, would a student come to Indiana? Because most of them are going to Florida. And in 2 days, I got 70 emails. I had to stop it because it was too much. And we're dealing with that. And one third of those students were students in biology because they lost their labs. Okay, so their education has been affected. But the problem is that now many U.S. Universities are offering to take some of these students, but then at the same time, the problem is that if we don't have the students in Puerto Rico, actually enrollments have gone down, and now the government can have an excuse to actually sell the University of Puerto Rico. Okay, which it has been a solid institution that has taught so many, luminaries in PuertoCo. In Puerto Rico, you can actually study for how much is the enrollment there? It's like $1,000 per. I'm asking my husband. It's like about $1,000, right, per year?
I paid $700 in my 4 years of college. $700.
And if you are in the 5% top of your class, you don't pay tuition.
I pay tuition only because of the La Junta when they put the $800 for a fee for.
Yeah. So.
At the end, we have to pay there was a move because the pro-annexation party has been looking to sell the university for a long time, and so at the end of my years of study, they put this special sort of tax that you had to pay in order to graduate, and that's why I had to pay. Otherwise, it would have been free. And I think that's an investment into your future, of course. No, I mean,
that has been
I'm not
really
talking,
important.
I'm talking socially, right? As a society, it's an investment to have people who.
Yeah. No, and other things that I observed there was that the amount of debris in front of the houses. I mean, there were streets that I'm very used to, but I could not really recognize because there was so much debris on the sides, not only branches and stuff like that, but also trash. So people are just, when they can find Clorox or, to put around because they have had problems of leptospirosis, problems with rats and also with mosquitoes, and which are affecting the elderly very much. There are a lot of problems with that, with the elderly, and dehydration. The health situation for people who are very vulnerable, who need machinery, oxygen or stuff of that sort. There have been a lot of death created by that. So it's desperate and it's heartbreaking, and you never thought that something like this could ever happen to you. And it's just that daily, and they are tired. And I can tell you also another story, which is our struggle to actually send a power generator to Puerto Rico. They have not gotten it yet. And the reason is that FEMA controls the shipments from Jacksonville. So if you're a common individual like I am, if you're in a corporation, you may be able to send some stuff. But for common people, FEMA was controlling the things that were taken to Puerto Rico, and it could happen, and it did happen to a number of people, that when the power generators got there, FEMA said, you know what, we need that, how much did it pay, here's the check, see you later. So you're like, can this be, and then the other situation, which is the noise of those generators and the smell. You could see the smog going all over the ocean in Puerto Rico because of the smell of that and the noise at night. It's tremendous. It's like it's hard to rest in that sense. So what I see is a population that is tired. This has gone on for so long, and I'm talking about the people who live in the metropolitan area. Those who are in the rural sites, that's another story. And I cannot believe that places where a bridge was broken, that there has not been, when we are in wars, right? The Navy or the Army, they do these bridges right away. Nothing like that has happened. How can this be possible? So yes, and the hard thing is to think about solutions, and it's hard. It's hard to think how can we help, and how can that help get there, and that's what moves the pueblo a pueblo. We can talk about that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, after listening to this, I am definitely like that in high spirits because you're like, well, Congress isn't doing it, and we can't do anything. So money, I just feel like if Congress doesn't move, then whatever efforts we're doing for Puerto Rico doesn't move. But in talks of foreign aid, can we trace where the money is going? And if it's reaching out to the people, I'm not sure if we here as volunteers, and not volunteer, but like whenever there's a disaster, we have the Red Cross and the major players who say donate. But as of now, can we trace to see what has been done?
It depends on who you send it with, right? Because, for example, the First Lady in Puerto Rico, she had all of this money that she has been collected. It's called Unidos por Puerto Rico. I would not recommend you that you support that because there has been some problems of transparency there. What has worked best is with aid that is going directly to the people. So that's why we have tried to vet that, and in the end, we are actually, that's what from people to people is about. So we actually vetted how we're going to actually take this money to Puerto Rico and who's going to manage this pretty closely. But there are a number of good efforts that you could trace. But the big ones, the problem with the Red Cross, how wonderful they are and everything, is that we may actually donate an amount of money to the Red Cross. That doesn't mean that it's going to get to Puerto Rico. They keep it, and they keep a good portion for administrative costs. So it depends, and there has been a lot of people who have not used the amount of aid properly. Actually, FEMA, some people have taken some stuff for FEMA. There was a story of a mayor who used a power generator for his own restaurant from FEMA, and it really is like really all of these people suffering, and you're playing with this. It's heartbreaking.
Just one point, really quickly. Part of the problem with the relief efforts is that when we understand the way relief efforts work in the U.S. mainland, for example, when Harvey went into Texas, you already had 10,000 line workers waiting to just go to Texas from Florida. But this sort of mass mobilization to get the state up and running, we don't see it in Puerto Rico, partly because the Association of States kind of wonder whether Puerto Rico would be able to pay the association back for the aid that was given. And so no sort of mass mobilization was seen for line workers or any sort of major relief efforts that was not from the federal government.
Yeah, and the government as well, they usually before the hurricane, the local governments are supposed to start asking for aid from FEMA and the other federal aid, right? That did not happen in the case of Puerto Rico. So there was problems with the local government, and there was problem with the way the federal government responded to Puerto Rico. So on both sides, there were major issues. They took a long time to do what they needed. It took them like 2 weeks. And to this day, now they're leaving the island, and still there are major issues, especially in the rural areas. But it seems that there is, from what I hear, and I'm not they really want the people from the rural areas to leave.
Sorry.
This is kind of jumping back a little bit, but you were talking about the three factions, the pro-independence, pro-statehood, and status quo. In your opinions, what do you believe, which faction do you think would be in Puerto Rico's best interest that would help kind of address long-term some of the issues that we discussed?
That would be tantamount to me deciding the future of Puerto Rico. So I'm not sure if I feel comfortable with that, but I can, for example, tell you that independence is mostly gone from the political spectrum nowadays. It used to have over 25% of the support in general elections earlier in the 20th century. Now there is a threshold in Puerto Rico for political parties to be enrolled for next gubernatorial elections, right? Each election, you have to have 5% of the vote or more in order to be able to be automatically enrolled for next election cycle. If you don't, you have to get 100,000 signatures to re-register. The Independence Party has lost registration quotas for the last two elections. And so we've seen it go down, right? Mm-hmm. We've seen it go down dramatically over the decades. Right now, the contest is mainly between status quo people and, in some form, and annexation people. But it must be said that the status quo people includes a bunch of different people. There's people who truly believe, as we talked before, that Puerto Rico has a separate sovereignty, even though the Supreme Court has told them that you don't. But there's also people who say, yes, we're a colony, what we want is more like autonomy. Let's have a sort of irregular federalism within the U.S., right? And there's sort of people that go like, let's be independent, but associated with the U.S., like an actual freely associated state. So it's the camp is divided. But going with talking directly about that, there's a historical reason for it. Around the middle of the 1970s, the pro-annexation party was founded. And the pro-annexation was marketed as statehood is for the poor. Right? So in the middle of the beginning of the second phase of version Bootstrap, which is a heavy capital intensive, there's this new political party that says, what we should do is become part of the U.S., stop being Puerto Ricans, and we're going to get even more money, more investment, things are going to get better. Statehood is in fact for the poor. And going from that, the annexation party has done everything that it can to make Puerto Rico less like a country and more like a state. And so it battles constantly to destroy or eliminate institutions that it sees as alien to the United States. And this is, for example, where the University of Puerto Rico comes in. The University of Puerto Rico, where I did my bachelor's, it's a bastion of dissenting thought, right? No pro-annexation. And so they've always seen it as a threat. But it's also, it produces 98% of all the research in the Caribbean. It's a top 10 university in the Americas, not only the Caribbean. So it's really, really, really good. And they've always seen it as a threat. And so what they've done is they funded a sort of private universities that would compete with it. When that didn't work because the university was still awesome, now they're trying to sell it outright. And that goes to the question of just like leave so that we can sell it. And of course, this goes to statehood for the poor and being U.S. citizens through 1917 because the U.S. needed people to conscript for World War I, but at the same time being told that citizenship can be taken away because you're not under the 14th Amendment, not quiet. This citizenship is complex, right? So you have the legal issue, you have a bundle of rights of which U.S. citizens living in Puerto Rico get a handful of, but not all. But it's also a cultural issue. After Irma and after Maria, we found that when people knew that Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens, they were twice as likely to be okay with the U.S. sending aid. But people who did not know that Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens, by and large, majority did not want aid to be sent. And this happens to me all the time as Puerto Rican. I get asked all the time if I have my green card. Most people that I come in contact with, they don't understand that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. And this plays into sort of citizenship, what is it? And also plays in Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Ricans have been told statehood is for the poor, and this goes to the idea of almost frustration and disbelief. Like, why, if I'm a U.S. citizen, why am I not treated the same? Why don't I get aid? Where is the aid? Why is it not coming? right? It's easier for me to just go to Florida because I'm a U.S. citizen. And so there's a sort of two discourses going on. One from the U.S. saying you're not part of us, you're belonging, we're not part. And then from Puerto Rico saying, wait, what do you mean?
But I wanted to add to what Joel was mentioning about the Independence Party. We need to consider that as Operation Bootstrap, what you saw before, was happening. One of the concerns of the United States, especially in the 1920s and 30s and so on, was actually the people who were anti-United States. And part of those were actually independentistas, people who wanted the independence of Puerto Rico. And in the 1950s, you find gag laws. It was, you would get into legal trouble for showing a Puerto Rican flag. And along with Operation Bootstrap, they also had what Muñoz Marin called Operation Serenity. The idea was, even though economically Puerto Rico is trying to look more like the United States, our soul remains Puerto Rican. So at the same time, culturally, it was like providing, calming the people by promoting the idea of Puerto Ricanness. So there was an Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, for example, that was also produced in the same years. So this idea of cultural nationalism vis-a-vis political nationalism are two separate things in Puerto Rico. So because being an independentista then became aligned with being leftist and being communist. So to this day, when you say you're an independentista, you are, it has an stigma attached to it. So more and more, the stakeholders have gained terrain. However, cultural nationalism has become more and more important in Puerto Rico. Everybody would tell you that nationalism is very important among Puerto Ricans. Just go to Chicago in May when they have the Puerto Rican parade. In my life, I have never seen so many Puerto Rican lives this size everywhere. I mean, it's huge. And now in Puerto Rico, you used to see always Puerto Rican flag with U.S. flag. It's flying by itself. And that is really, to me, that was very meaningful to see that everywhere you would see a Puerto Rican flag. Now, the other thing that has been very important lately, I would say that with Maria, is that what you're saying that statehood is for the poor has been changed, and now what the pro-statehood party is saying is that what they want is equality with the United States. They want to be able to request the same things as other states for the Puerto Ricans, and this discourse that Puerto Ricans are Americans, to me has been like the American people are discovering Puerto Rico. That Puerto Ricans are Americans. And they have really had a very strong media, they have really promoted that in the media. And I think they have been successful in that sense. If this is going to bring statehood for Puerto Rico, I doubt it. I doubt it. Not in the current Congress and not in the current climate.
Yeah, when you see the times of the U.S. as the next territories, so territory becomes incorporated, which is kind of like a promise to become a state at some point. Every time they get incorporated, they are profitable, right? So they add something to the union. Puerto Rico, of course, needless to say, would not be able to add anything but debt. So it's highly unlikely.
Well, but I think it's going to change now with all of these millionaires taking over the island and using Puerto Rico as a tax paradise.
Also, when we talk about statehood for the poor and cultural nationalism, the statehood for the poor concept comes together with this idea that Puerto Rico, for example, Puerto Ricans are crazy about Miss Universe, right? We have this lifelong battle with Venezuela for the number of crowns that we have, right? And so the statehood for the poor comes with Puerto Rican Miss Universe, right? We don't lose that.
We're in basketball.
Puerto Rico representation, but of course we would. Yeah.
And the World Series, yeah.
The World Series, Olympic Committee, right? Puerto Ricans are crazy about the Olympics and seeing their team there. So it's like, yes, we're going to be a state, but we're still going to keep the Olympic Committee, which is nuts, of course, right? But that's the way it's sold. That's the way it's sold, and that's the way people understand.
And beating the United States in those arenas is huge. It's huge.
If you remember, a couple of years back, Puerto Rico won one game against the U.S. People were in basketball game. people went crazy in Puerto Rico. They went crazy against, because won the NBA All-Star team, and that was a huge.
Oh, the World Series where all the Puerto Ricans were dyeing their hair blonde.
And it sort of this sort of cultural nationalism comes out in spite of the political colonialism, or because of it, right? Depends on who you ask. But it's a sort of outlet for I am myself. I'm not part of you.
You can be doing all of these things to me, but I'm still proud. We are Puerto Ricans even in the moon. There's a huge song about that.
Puerto Ricans speak Spanish still, right? And the U.S. tried to change that in the beginning of after invasion. They brought American teachers. They also brought Christian missionaries, and my grandmother and my great-grandmother told me stories about it, and they resisted it. For the rural people, they called English el difícil, the difficult one, and they refused to learn it, right? And that's become part of sort of cultural resistance that's deeply tied to nationalism.
But it has, now you go to the shopping centers and you find more and more people speaking in English. And I think it has to do with YouTube and Facebook and all of that.
Yeah. Our generation definitely has a different take on it.
Yeah. Questions? Yes.
So this has been very informative for me from a historical standpoint, and I hate to sort of widen the scope, but as you talked about the history of the U.S. with territories, I'm curious to have sort of a more contextual discussion around other territories such as like the USVI and sort of how that has happened, like what that history has been. I know, Professor Diaz, you do more research around the Caribbean overall, but just curious your perspectives, because it does really come across as saddening and disheartening that the U.S. is somewhat of a dictator, which I was not aware of. And so I'm just curious your insights on, is this a trend for the U.S.? Joel, you mentioned like American Samoa, but I'm just curious, because of Maria and the impact that USVI experienced as well, sort of what those trends look like.
I can talk a little bit about the U.S. Virgin Islands. So the U.S. Virgin Islands became part of the United States in 1916-17 when they purchased St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas from the Danish. And actually, that's one of the reasons that promoted the U.S. to give citizenship to Puerto Ricans, because the Danish said, okay, we're finally going to sell you these islands, but you have to make these people U.S. citizens. So that was part of the deal as well in 1917. So the U.S. Virgin Islands have become a true tax paradise since then. What you find is 100,000 inhabitants over there, and it has become the hub of celebrities and millionaires who own resorts and the like. And the reason is that if Puerto Rico is a tax paradise, the U.S. Virgin Islands, I think, is like 90% of tax benefit. The situation of the U.S. Virgin Islands is pretty sad. It was flattened with Irma and Maria, and usually they get overshadowed by Puerto Rico. So that's why, from people to people, we are trying to help Mexico, but also Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, because they really need help. And what you see in Puerto Rico, you are also seeing in U.S. Virgin Islands. Actually, Puerto Rico was helping the U.S. Virgin Islands with Irma. Some people were going to the hospitals in Puerto Rico, and then Maria comes, right? So the situation in the U.S. Virgin Islands is pretty dire.
In terms of the relationship the U.S. maintains with its territories, because the U.S. has never solved the question of what it actually wants to do with the territories, whether it's a formal imperial power or not, we see that the treatment that territories get is ad hoc. So it depends on the relationship that the U.S. had with the territory in terms of what it wanted to do. So in the Spanish-American War, for example, we know that the U.S. got Guam, got Puerto Rico, right? But it also got Philippines. But the U.S. never had intentions of annexing these people. So in 1967, they were given independence, right? And so the treatment that Puerto Rico, that the U.S. has with the territories depends on the importance that the U.S. gives to the territory in question. In terms of Puerto Rico was necessary for national defense during the Cold War, and so it was kept. And before that, it was important for sugar interests, right? And that's also the reason why the U.S. was eyeing Cuba, which was one of the war booties of the Spanish-American War. Since it couldn't get Cuba, Puerto Rico was the next step for sugar cane. After that, of course, we know Cold War became important militarily. So the relationship, Guam, also important militarily, so it never gave it up. Palau, it was given as a protectorate by the United Nations. They're actually a freely associated state to the United States. And so the U.S. usually treats its territories, or not usually, treats its territories in an ad hoc fashion, depending on the interest that it has with them, without formally resolving the question of how it wants to relate to these territories. So it's individual in each case.
And it seems like even the response for aid is
Yes.
parallel.
Yeah. So, for example, Guamanians, they hold a straw poll for U.S. presidency every year. They, of course, know that it's not going to be counted, but they still hold it, and they vote in a higher percentage than U.S. citizens do.
Oh, yeah.
But doesn't the U.S. Virgin Islands has Congress, people in Congress, right?
Just like a resident commissioner, just like Puerto Rico.
Just
so it
like
has
in Puerto
voice.
Rico.
They don't vote.
No, they don't vote.
They're not allowed to
It's
vote.
an unincorporated territory as well.
So resident commissioners of Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, for example, they can vote in subcommittees where they don't decide by their vote, which means that you don't vote, right? And you cannot vote on the floor. You can only speak.
Yeah. Something that you also see now in the U.S. Virgin Islands is that there has been a population turnover, in the sense that they are also trying to take people from the U.S. Virgin Islands out. And you can see that a lot in St. Thomas. The population of European Americans have really increased in the last years. So it's like a global gentrification, if you will.
None of the territories control their territorial boundaries. So the U.S. Customs is the one that controls who comes in and comes out and that applies to all territories, right? That is constant. So when you come to Puerto Rico, if you're not from the U.S., you have to apply for a visa through the U.S. consulate, right? Because for effects of national boundaries, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, right? And we go again to the ad hoc fashion.
But for IU, Puerto Rico is a foreign country.
Right.
Interesting.
And
It's a mess, yeah.
You were talking earlier about the debt portfolio and how it has exploded since 2000. Who are the main players in holding that debt, the public debt?
okay, you want to go?
You start.
So in terms of public debt for Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican debt was always very attractive to bond markets because we go back to the Martian Marine Act, right? It made it triple exempt. And so it made it triple exempt also with the understanding at the time that the U.S. placed full faith in credit. So, and this was done, of course, to kind of develop the island very quickly. The U.S. also, the Puerto Rico, also has a provision in the Constitution that says that it will pay debt beyond, in front of everything else, right? So even basic services. So the first thing that's going to be paid is bondholders. Because it was triple exempt, because investment and company law do not apply to Puerto Rico, because of the Constitution provision, bonds were extremely popular. In the first years, during Operation Bootstrap leading up to the 2000s, that did not pose a problem. Once Puerto Rico enters into this phase of imperial forgetfulness, right, politicians turn to bonds to pay for essential services. Of both of the annexation party and the statehood party do the same. We don't actually know who owns most of the debt because the company law does. Remember, because Puerto Rico is exempt from investment law and company law, we disclosures are not necessary. And so, for example, the teachers fund, the teachers pension fund for Massachusetts, for example, was 50.4% Puerto Rican, but was not labeled as such, right? And so only after Puerto Rico said, I cannot pay, did the teachers in Massachusetts find out that their bonds were mostly Puerto Rican bonds. So we don't exactly know. What we do know now is that most of these pension funds that had this sort of debt sold them to hedge funds, right, who just got them for low, looking for a profit, right? So you buy them low, turn it up. And so you buy low and you expect to be paid in full, or that's your aim, of course, which are, they're called vulture funds, right? So we know that some of these funds have the debt, but we don't know who had it before.
And actually, it's very interesting that the oversight board, they have declined every single time when we want to have to audit that debt, which makes a lot of sense. And that's why on May 1st, there was a general strike, and that's what people were asking for. We want to know where this debt came from so that, we can do better. And from either side, that has not happened, and it's not going to happen. They have really dismissed it.
Similarly, a claim was brought to the court that's handling the case per PROMESA, right? So PROMESA allows for a bankruptcy judge from Manhattan to be placed in Puerto Rico to oversee this process. A claim was brought to find out if the role of the banks in this process could be considered, and we just got it yesterday that we cannot look at that. Mm-hmm. So you basically just pay.
Right. And the other interesting thing is that the hedge funds, the people who have the hedge funds, actually press Congress because they want their full money back, even if that means that all of the basic services in Puerto Rico, that the common people are going to be affected. And actually, there have been layoff. The school system, everything has been cut down, even the pension funds for the teachers, which is really, really painful, that you have been paying for your retirement, and now that you see that you may not live out of this, it's hard.
Not only for the teachers, but the general pension fund, my mother's pension fund, for example, only has funds for the next 2 years. After that, funds are not guaranteed. So my mother will only basically receive her pension for 2 more years if nothing is done, and then that's it. No more money. There was a question from the back.
Our last question.
You mentioned a little earlier that rather than the full rights associated with U.S. citizenship, that the territories are only granted sort of fundamental rights, and I was wondering if the rights that are fundamental enough to apply to these territories have ever been formally enumerated, or if this is one of these questions that keeps being raised in courts.
There have been some.
There are some. For example, the Sixth Amendment does not apply to Puerto Rican courts. So it's only
trial by jury too.
Trial by jury. As far as I understand, this should be common to us who study constitutional law. You don't do more than you need to, right? So the court just said fundamental rights, and then you don't define that. You let it take its course. And so the things that have been brought forward, some of them have been denied. So there's no Sixth Amendment right or trial by jury. But we don't know the exact list because not all has been litigated. So it's again ad hoc fashion, right? So it's not systematic, just depends.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much to our panelists. Give them a
Thank you.
Right. Well, I would just like to thank everyone for being here. We have some information and some donation boxes at the back for De Pueblo a Pueblo. Professor Diaz, did you want to say anything else about De Pueblo a Pueblo?
Well, this is an effort by IU faculty, staff, and students. We got together to see how we could help Puerto Rico. So we started this fund drive, especially with a concert 2 weeks ago, almost. And the idea is that we're going to keep going, having events and asking people to, every contribution is great. And it's very likely this is going to go for the construction of houses in a very neglected area in Puerto Rico, Loíza Aldea, that is part of the African American culture in Puerto Rico, and unfortunately has not received much attention from the government. The people who are going to be working with this are two University of Puerto Rico professors who also work with students in building houses that are affordable for the people. So on those 50 houses, I don't think we're going to be able to get that much money, but if we can at least put 3 or 4, that would be wonderful. And those houses are going to go to people who were displaced by the hurricane. We're also going to be doing something similar for the U.S. Virgin Islands and for the earthquake, people who have suffered from the earthquake in Mexico.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you for helping to organize such an amazing organization. And please go ahead and check out their information that they have back there. If there's food left, please have more food. Feel free to come up and ask questions of our amazing panelists. But please thank them along with me and give them a huge round of applause for their amazing information.
May I just add one thing, is that we have a website. It's called www.frompeopletopeople.com or depuebloapueblo.com. And there you could see our events, and you can also donate over there, and you can actually specify where you want your money to go. We appreciate any help and any events you want to put together. Thank you.